There are two falafel shops in Beirut that have the same name, the same menu, and that stand right next to each other, with only a wall separating them. The shops are owned by two brothers. One is owned by Zuhair, the other by Fuad. Now, these brothers used to run one falafel shop together. It was their father's shop, and their father taught them how to run the place. But in 2006, these brothers had a falling out, at which time Fuad bought the shop next door and opened up his own falafel shop with the same name, the same logo, and the same recipe. The brothers don't talk about the details of that falling out, but it seems it had to do something with the future of their business. They've had a feud ever since, and they don't talk to each other, even though they spend their days working mere feet from each other. Customers likewise choose a side in the feud. Each shop has its own customer base, and their customers head straight to the shops where their loyalties lie. This story of Zuhair and Fuad was recently published by the New York Times. And I think part of the reason why the New York Times published this story is because it's so, unfortunately, relatable. Sometimes people who are the closest have the greatest risk of ripping their relationship apart. And when they do, the results can be dramatic. It's especially difficult when close people work together and they have such big dreams for their enterprise, and when their dreams conflict with the other people's dreams. Our passage today also tells of a disagreement that leads to a split between a dynamic duo. At this point in Acts, Paul and Barnabas have been together for a while now. They were commissioned together, they were sent out and preached together, and they were even mistaken as being the Greek gods Zeus and Hermes together. But now Paul and Barnabas are trying to discern what's best for their ministry at this point, and they can't agree. Barnabas wants to take Mark with them, but Paul doesn't want to take Mark, since Mark left Paul and Barnabas before. As Luke, who wrote Acts, describes this argument, he says that they had a disagreement that was so sharp that they couldn't compromise. Instead, they had to part company. Barnabas takes Mark, and Paul takes Silas, and the two head off in different directions. When we read the book of Acts today, it's easy to focus on the end of Acts 2, when everyone in the church is getting along great, sharing everything they own, and breaking bread together. But as we probably know pretty well by now, ministry doesn't often look like that. But Acts is helpful in giving us a holistic picture of the church in all its glory and in all its weakness. And in today's passage, we see both glory and weakness on a small scale by hearing about these great church leaders and the argument that caused them to separate. As future church leaders who will experience conflicts and arguments related to ministry, this seems like an appropriate text for us to study. When we work at a church or school or another ministry, we're going to have big dreams for that ministry. And sometimes our dreams are going to conflict with another person's dreams. In fact, we already experience conflict here at PTS. If the campus debate last spring about a speaker's opinions on marriage and ordination tells us anything, it's that people in our community passionately hold divergent opinions about what it means to do ministry well. So let's delve more deeply into the story of Paul and Barnabas, seeing what it can teach us about conflict in ministry. First, this passage shows that divisive disagreements in ministry do happen, but it doesn't say that they should happen. Paul and Barnabas are respected as influential followers of Christ, but that doesn't mean that the author of Acts is saying that it was a good thing for them to separate. Luke cares a lot about unity within the church, but he also knows that unity isn't a simple accomplishment. In fact, Acts commonly shows the realities of community life by pairing a story of unity right next to a story of disunity. So perhaps it's unsurprising that the story of Paul and Barnabas' split comes immediately after the Council of Jerusalem, which decided that Gentiles could indeed be a part of the church, a huge accomplishment for Christian agreement and unity across difference. But of course, immediately after that passage, Paul and Barnabas end their partnership over a disagreement. By telling these stories together, Paul shows that true unity is a process. There are sometimes huge accomplishments, such as the Council at Jerusalem. And there are also setbacks, like two partners in mission, arguing and parting ways. Conflict is a very real part of the church, but it isn't necessarily something that we should strive for or complacently accept in our ministries. The second thing we can learn from this passage is that God continues to work in and through conflicts. The passage that details this disagreement is pretty short. Luke simply states the reason for the conflict and how they split. There's no indication that Luke, Barnabas, or Paul was worried in the slightest about this conflict hurting the church. Although it's not good to have conflict in our ministries, one benefit of conflict is that it makes it abundantly clear that our ministries and the church as a whole don't succeed because of us. Barnabas, Paul, you, me, we are all fallen people who are trying our best to serve God well, but we fail and we quarrel and we make mistakes along the way. And that's okay. Because our weaknesses make it clear that God alone is the director and sustainer of the church. Like Paul later writes in 2 Corinthians, God's power is made perfect in weakness, so we can boast of our weaknesses that the power of Christ may dwell in us. Of course, we shouldn't boast of the pain that we cause through conflicts, but it is worth it to stop and look around at all that God is doing when it seems like our failings should hurt ministry. The third thing we learn about conflict in this passage is that within ministry, conflict sometimes happens when people have different priorities, but they want equally good things. The fact is that both Paul and Barnabas had great intentions. Paul wanted to make sure that as he went to visit and encourage the believers, he had a good team with him, a team that he could count on. Since Mark left them in the past, Paul very practically decides that it isn't a good idea to take him with them again. Paul is the practical pastor among us, the pastor who doesn't want to take on extra challenges when a simple method will work. Barnabas, on the other hand, wants to generously give Mark another chance. Luke tells us earlier that Barnabas is actually a nickname that the apostles gave him, because Barnabas means son of encouragement. Barnabas is an encourager. He's the pastor among us who wants to use his ministry to demonstrate God's love to everyone, even when it doesn't seem practical or easy to do so. Both Paul and Barnabas are trying to serve God well. They just have different ideas about what that means. But even though their different personalities create conflict, both Paul's level-headedness and Barnabas's radical generosity are used to serve God's church. And here we come back to our second point about God continuing to work in conflict. Instead of having one team of Paul and Barnabas sent out, now we have two teams. Paul and Silas go through Syria and Cilicia, and Barnabas and Mark go to Cyprus. And what a good reminder this is to us as we deal with people who have different ideas about ministry than we do. That God gave each of us the gifts that we have, and God will use all those gifts for the good of the church. Does this mean that all opinions about ministry are equally valid? No. But it does mean that we should love each other as fellow members of the church who are also trying their best to follow God rightly. And by remembering this, we can begin to work towards reconciliation, even when we have disagreements. Luke never goes on to tell us whether Paul and Barnabas resolve their argument. In fact, this is the last time Barnabas appears in the book of Acts. However, the letters of Paul give us a pretty good clue. In 1 Corinthians, Paul commends Barnabas' ministry. Paul even mentions Mark a few times in his letters. Notably, in 2 Timothy, he writes, "Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful in my ministry." So even though this conflict did happen, Paul's letters suggest that disagreements don't have to be never-ending. There is hope for reconciliation. And we too should aim for reconciliation so that we may work in unity for the good of God's church. I'm not sure what to say to Zuhair and Fuad. I'm not sure if these brothers will be close again. Just as Luke leaves the story about Paul and Barnabas hanging, so we don't know what will happen with these two brothers. But we do know that our God is bigger than human conflicts, and our God is a God of reconciliation. God continued to work through Paul and Barnabas. God is still at work in these falafel shops in Beirut. And God is still at work in our own lives and ministries, even in the midst of conflict. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.